And yes, we're live. Thank you, everyone. Hope you have had a good evening. Thank you so much for being with us today at this very, very lovely Friday evening for Queer Fabulations, Welding Bodies in Project Salome with the inimitable Ong Keng Sen here. The peerless doyen, can I use that word? I can use that word, of Singapore theatre and expanded performances, who will be presenting his first major work in this country since 2017's Trojan Women with the National Theatre of Korea, which is oh so brilliant. So a little bit about this session before we go on. Queer Fabulation is a session under Plus Discuss, which is a special sidebar that is part of SIFA 2022 that accompanies the major commissioned works. And through this series, we really want to probe and explore the different creative processes behind the development of these lovely works that we will soon see, as well as your own personal working styles, idiosyncrasies, and histories. So in this session, we are very, very fortunate to have a very, very unique format, because every other session thus far has been pre-recorded and edited and given the affordances of post-production. Well, here we have something that is quite uniquely live and isolated this instance. So for those of you, our lovely audience who are tuning in, we have a QR code available on the screen. It is floating in the digital ether right in front of me, but I can't point it out because it doesn't exist in real life here. Please feel free, to log on to our Slido and drop in any question you might have for Keng Sen along the duration of this session, and we will pick up and answer them as we go along. So this is really a nice and convivial chat. And without any further ado, I'm just going to jump straight into it. It's always such a pleasure to talk about you, to talk about your work and, how they have transformed, not just in the sense of transforming, but also having transformed the landscape of performance making in Singapore over this past few decades. And I guess the first question that I would have, is, from your earlier practices, to the kind of works they've been developing at the turn of the century, Desdemona to Lear, to Trojan Women in 2017, and now to Project Salome, there has always been this very interesting ways of working with the different valencies of cultural forms and genres and gestures and movements. And, I guess at this inflection point, I also just want to pick your brain a little about how you work, with these degrees and ideas and constructs of culture in how you devise a performance, a work, and, has it changed over the course of this past few years?
Well, first of all, thank you, Alfonse. Thank you, SIFA. Thank you, Art House. And thank you especially to Natalie, because she has been talking with me about this commission since end of 2019. So it's taken a few years to develop because of the pandemic intervention. I suppose I would say, I try to follow very much what the individual is, and very often, it leads me into very different spaces, because of course each of the individuals that I work with in the different productions, especially the documentary productions, tend to be very special people, and they have a perspective which then continues to lead me on to actually then writing the story, and perhaps to think about certain thematics. So of course I begin the project with some 4 ideas, like for example, with this production, I knew that I was interested in trying to find a pandemic form or pandemic paradigm, because I think that we can no longer look at performing arts in the same way after this intervention. Even though it looks like everything is fine now, everything is opening up, I think that there has been a change of mindsets, perhaps. And I felt like I needed to find a paradigm for this time, and also that I wanted very much to look at how we could do a production without colonizing the individuals involved, right? Because of course when you're asking individuals to tell their stories, then if you're encasing it into a classic or like Salome, then basically they're forced to be Salome. But here the question was how to let them breathe together with Salome and to find a kind of an interweaving middle ground.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for that, and of course for bringing up in a way the kind of conceptual elephants in the room in how you have creatively worked with, you know, text and stalwarts from what we can consider broadly to be, you know, the classics or even, you know, within that contested term of the canon, and I guess, you know, the idea of canonicity is also just something I want to, you know, yank on a little bit, you know, particularly when you are devising works in the selection of the base text through which, you know, you then allow for these different refractions. You know, have you always had that curiosity or the impetus then to, you know, work with this parameters to see how then you can break the boundaries, you know, of cultural inflections and backgrounds and context, or, you know, has it been somewhat of a serendipitous way of working with, let's say, the great Shakespeare's or, you know, the other great texts that exist in classical theatre?
I suppose for me, I think that very often I like to work with a strong conceptual foundation. So because of that, I do have a kind of a foundation of ideas which then I propose to the individuals involved. And in this particular production, it was to look at what is actually projection, right? Because Project Salome has a double meaning, you know, it can mean the noun project, and then it can also mean the verb, which is to project something. So I think that we can think about film projection. It's the noun of a film projection, but it's also projecting something, projecting light onto a screen. And in the same way with social media here, because in this particular production we are interweaving both social media and film, and of course the live stage. I was also very fascinated by how in the last 10 years, how there is so much projection of self in social media. You know, that means that is it true what happened, or is it a fiction what happened, but there is a projection of self through the different photographs that are shown or different videos that are shown, and sometimes it's very profound what we are reading in the social media, I think, or what we are viewing in the social media as we imagine what could be behind this projection.
Yeah, thank you for bringing up, you know, that word projection, which, as we know, is central to the title of the works, or the different aspects and components of the work as well. Because, you know, to project also has a very specific nuance and texture in terms of how we can relate it to performance as a whole, as a conceptual domain and entire disciplinary field of action. And this is something that you definitely are intimately familiar with, for we have with us the very lovely Dr. Ong, as opposed to just previously Mr. Ong or just Maestro Ong. And, you know, kind of from that position of having conducted, you know, that much research across both, you know, theoretical aspects, but also to have it as a form of embodied practice, you know, given your continuous and impressive line of works that dates back, you know, decades, even though I'm sure you are only 27 this year.
Yes.
How then has, you know, also the potency and the possibility of performance, you know, shifted for you from I guess, you know, where everyone begins with a fairly classical and traditional notion of a certain body in a certain kind of space, to now, you know, with fragmented bodies, you know, with immaterial bodies, ethereal projection, psychological bodies, you know, operating in these different stages and theaters. Yeah.
I think that for me the strongest element is, of course, in the actual title of this talk that you invented. The title is about Fabulations.
Yes.
And so, you know, what is fabulation, right? So if you look at a dictionary, or if you Google it, fabulation is about some kind of fantastic storytelling. And of course, fabulation is linked to fabulous. You know? So I think that it's very important to think about how where does fabulation stand between fact and fiction, or beyond fiction, beyond fact? So it's very much related a little bit to the question that you asked earlier. I mean, what is the concept around this piece? And I think that, you know, in the last, maybe I'll say like the last 5 years, I've become much more interested, well, maybe more than that, but at least like the last 10 years, more and more interested in queer performance. And with that, it also means that what exactly is the queering of tradition, or what is the queering of documentary, for example. And, you know, because documentary is supposed to tell the facts, but actually in queering documentary, you're also leading to a kind of creative space where facts are being invented. And is it fiction? No, it's not fiction, it's a fabulation, where actually fabulation allows you to deny both fact and fiction. Fabulation is something which is imagined, is fantastic, and it's a kind of a rethinking of my own practice, because, you know, for you know, when I first started in documentary work, I was very much about finding facts, and then I realized that actually it's not important what is the real fact, because that's a kind of a judgmental position, but actually for the subjective experience of the storyteller, the subjective experience of the documentary protagonist, it is a fact. It happened to them, however we imagine it. So in a way, you know, I had to leave behind my legal training where we're looking for facts, but here we are looking for fabulations in the mind of the protagonist of whose story we're telling. So in a way, this sense of rethinking of practice, where the fabulation is neither fiction nor fact, leads to a kind of an entry point of this particular production, because Salome is a double portrait, and one of the portraits is of Michaela, who lives in Berlin, and they are basically have been living there for the last 8 years, and Michaela is an asylum seeker from Syria, journeying through Istanbul, and then basically walking from Athens into Hungary, which is really quite far, you know, and then finally ended up in Germany and stayed there for 8 years, and now is still in the process of getting his papers in Germany, or their papers in Germany. And I think that this is an interesting question. How do we live with and listen to their narrations and their fabulations, and not become either judgmental about looking for the facts or looking at what's fictional? So I think that this sense of the projection of self as a question of how do we be in this world with dignity and respect is very much the foundation of this particular work, because of course Salome is also about the retrieval from the misogynistic imaginations or directions of this work, because basically she was always the woman who beheaded the man who scorned her love, and so immediately she's placed into a misogynistic position where she's judged as some evil witch who beheaded the person who did not love her. So I think that once we look at a kind of a 21st century embodiment and rendition of that, where we look at both queer bodies and at cis females, because Janice Cole, who presents the body of Salome live in Victoria Theatre and also performs in the social media performance, she is definitely very present in terms of looking at misogyny, and I think that there is a very strong bend in trying to retrieve from history the fact that this character has been seen to be fairly negative. I mean, she's a stalker, she's Glenn Close, she's Dojoji from the Japanese no theater, where, you know, because her love is unrequited, she kills a man. So this kind of fatal attraction narrative we see repeated in Hollywood, we see repeated in classics, and I think that it's quite important that Oscar Wilde actually makes her into the heroine, and in a way goes some distance already to putting her voice rather than that she is the villainess. Right?
Yeah, I mean, thank you for that. It's dense and enriching and you know, also expanding that my own dimensions of interpretations for Project Salome as well, because you know something that then kind of sticks with me, you know, in that conceptual becoming of Salome, you know, across, you know, the ages and eras of history then is also, of course, of agency and gaze. And here I am, of course, also then referring to, I think in an earlier text when John Berger was talking about how, you know, in painting the image of woman as vanity, men cast women to be vanity. And of course the idea of the gaze, the idea of, you know, the visuality, the opticality of seeing and then pinning someone down with that line of sight, I think is also what creates such an interesting power relation and dynamic that you have quite elegantly blurred. Because then we are taken into this liminal zone where it is post-fiction, it is post-fact, but it is not post-truth. You know, and it is, and the truth and the veracity of, you know, Michaela and as Bobola or Michaela as Michaela or Michaela playing a version of Michaela, you know, emerges to the floor with that to the fore with that ambivalence. And you know, as someone who has worked not so long ago, because you are 27 after all, you know, in cinema, with, for example, Army Days to now, you know, with another work that features the moving image so heavily and so centrally, you know, how would you describe, you know, your relationship to the camera, to the lens, and to gazing?
I think that, you know, I began a lot of my work in as a kind of a babe in the woods, you know, because I was very innocent, I think, in terms of looking at both film, at film in particular, you know, and actually then after that film, Army Days, I never wanted to do film again, you know, and at the time I was really just interested in the translation from theatre, from the stage to the film, because this piece, this script, Michael Chang's Army Days, had been done on the stage, and my company T Works had been involved in it, and so I was in a way kind of like moving it, translating it from the stage to the film, and of course I'm constantly amazed at how it's remained in the consciousness of the imagination of Singaporeans, this film. And I must say that after the film, I really didn't feel a need to ever do film again. And so it was actually the kind of the pandemic that brought me to thinking like, what can I do in my own apartment? You know, what can I do in my own apartment in Berlin, where I was living at a time, where it's, in a sense, I'm fascinated with, like, your body is restricted during the pandemic, but your mind is still roaming, and in fact we have to keep the fantasy alive, or else we would be completely killed by the lockdown. So I thought that, okay, so what if I turned the camera, you know, what if I turned the apartment into a stage or into a film set? And that was really the kind of the beginning of just trying to break the stasis that we were all in the last 3 years. And I mean, I hadn't been so badly affected because actually, of course, the pandemic, there were many delayed productions. So I premiered productions in Taipei and also in the US in those 5 years that I've not been working in Singapore. But I felt very much that I couldn't continue to make theatre pretending that that Corona had not happened. And so somehow the film medium allowed me to go back into a different space. So, you know, and I was, I felt lured again to look at what film is. The film, after all, is the gaze of the film camera is both a gaze which is unaware, and very often also it can be very self-reflexive. So it's much harder to do that in theater unless you have a deliberate break. While in film, you can just pull the camera back, and when you pull the camera back, you realize that it's that we are all surrounded by technology, right? So when you pull this camera back, you realize that it's nothing. You just move it 1 meter, and suddenly we see everything. You know, that we are surrounded by screens and by, you know, people who are working on this talk show right now. So I think that this line of the exposure of the artifice is so easy, because you just have to move the camera. While in the stage, there is so much there's so much that's kept at stake, millions of dollars that's kept at stake to make the stage like real. And so I just felt like I needed that kind of fluidity, which the pandemic then kind of forced me into. And so I felt that, okay, let's start to make film again.
Yeah, no, thank you for that, because in a way it also harkens back to the ontology of cinema in how it presents narrativity. Because once we go beyond, you know, a teleology or technological origin of cinema, and we see, you know, with the advent of classical Hollywood, how so much of it also then draws from the knowledges and the practices of theater. Mm-hmm. And, you know, in this way, you know, what you have done is kind of reversing that directionality and inflection. And it is also on this note, you know, and kind of drawing from my original point about gazers and gazing. And of course, now they have brought up, you know, the ideas of confinement and how, you know, the site of what we can constitute as domesticity could also in a way be rendered and given a kind of theatrical life and spirit. I think it would be lovely if we can maybe just play a very, very brief scene that occurs on the balcony of the film, which I think everyone will appreciate as we continue our discussion right after.
Okay.
Yes.
Sweet face. Mommy must be a bee to bring all this honey. Honey, let me taste your honey. Honey, honey. Big head, big head. You're annoyed, angry. Come and get me if you can. Here it is. Golden hair, like a sunshine. Come and let it shine on this gorgeousness. I wanna be sun-kissed. Apollo, Apollo, your partner lips are so juicy, like pomegranate. I wanna know them like sea waves know the shore.
And yeah, that was, in a sense, one of my favorite sequences, even though it occurs, you know, fairly early on in the film, or the filming aspect of the work, which, you know, everyone can find out soon enough and have the pleasure of finding out soon enough. You know, when Michaela, as Bovula, ventures onto the balcony, the one interesting liminal interface between the private and the public, between, you know, the interior and the exterior, to catcall men, presumably handsome ones, presumably handsome and fit ones, on the streets of Berlin. You know, for me, I think that scene is particularly fascinating because, you know, it plays with the directionality and depth of space. It plays with, you know, our very acute sense of time, because when there is catcalling, our sense of time narrows down to the object and the subjects of that catcalling, as well as then, of course, on that singularly trained lens from the back that witnesses, Bobola's contortions and theatricality. And, I guess it is one thing that I also want to ask you more about in working with Michaela as Bobola and as Michaela, opening close inverted commas, in modulating between these spheres of honesty and theatricality. What was that experience like?
I suppose, first of all, maybe the audience, the public should know a little bit about Michaela, right? Because Michaela is Michaela, in English, and Michaela, when they arrived in Europe, they were Michael. And Michaela then went through a kind of a transformation, and here we are talking about the ritual of shedding identities and also of assuming new identities, right? New identities to survive and to find a way to negotiate and transact some of the difficulties living as a migrant asylum seeker. So I think that what is interesting is that for me, this liminal zone of the balcony is very much the kind of rehearsal process that I had with them, because, of course, when I'm rehearsing, we're not rehearsing the script. Of course, we read the play together, and we read it several times. But actually, I was involved in just interviewing them and trying to find common ground and also empathies. And one of the most interesting discoveries was that Michael, the male version, the gay male version of their identity had to be, in a sense, killed off, because Michael, or the gay male identity, was unable to transact some of the complexities of their future life in Germany as an asylum seeker. And what is interesting is that the particular character, Bobola, this drag female personality, larger than life female personality, fantastic personality, was actually really factually created during the pandemic, because she came as a stroke of genius to them when they were locked down. And when Michaela dawned on this personality, they really started to hackle the men on the street as a way of revenge. Because what was fascinating in the interview was just one line which Michaela said, which was that, when I was living in the street, whenever I put on makeup with my beard as Michael, and I walked on the streets, the people on the street would spit at me and would laugh at me, and so it was my revenge. It was my emancipation and my revenge that in the pandemic they couldn't come up to get me, and I would hackle them from the balcony as Bobola, as this larger than life Syrian mummy character that's actually based on their mother. So I think that it was just so fascinating for me in the discovery of the rehearsal process of that. This was how Bobola, this drag personality, happened during the pandemic, and in a way it was a way to transact and to emancipate them from a lot of the oppressions that they experience in their daily life as a gay man with a beard and with makeup. And I think that this whole sense of coming to a new identity, a kind of a queer identity, where from Michael or from Michael, they assumed a new identity of Michaela or Michaela in brackets, so that that it's a queer assumption of identity. Yeah. So I think this liminal space of what we of being in between what we see now on camera and real life, or the life that they lived on the streets and during the pandemic, and then our rehearsal where there were often moments of illumination, tears, and also something where it was in between. It was not for the public. It was only for me, of course, and at the same time, it was a shamanic ritual for themselves as well.
Yeah, thank you for that. And this is also the part when we are starting to have some questions roll in from our lovely audience members. And I'm just going to start with one because it is tied into what then I also want to ask you, which is, Project Salome is in a way a series of interconnected and intertwined vignettes and pieces that draw together different bodies, different contexts, and different ways of articulating truths. And so we have an audience members who want to ask you, how does this double portrait then connect with the staged performance at Victoria Theatre? What is in a way architecturally speaking, for example, the keystone that locks the performances in place to present something that is, while expensive and kaleidoscopic, still has a certain sense of unity and contiguity. Yes.
Well, I think that in the Victoria Theatre stage, you are basically watching a live film being mixed with this film of Bobala, right? Janice is performing on stage as the head of Salome, and I think that this is really the big kind of appropriation that we are involved in, or is a kind of maybe appropriation is not even necessary, but is a kind of stepping aside from the misogynistic tale of the man's head, who then becomes the star, because even Caravaggio paints this picture, and Caravaggio paints the man's head on a platter, and then on the background is the evil witch. So she's in the background, but the foreground is the head of the man. And so part of the narrative is about what if on stage we actually know of and see a character called the head of Salome, right? That the story is no longer told from the perspective of a poor male who was beheaded, but you have the story of the bust or the head of Salome, just like the head of Nefertiti, right? Nefertiti is the most famous bust that was excavated from Egypt and transported to Berlin. And what wondrous tales could she tell if she could speak? So this idea of like you have a Sphinx head or you have a Salome's head, and she is telling these narratives. So what we see on stage is a kind of interweaving, because I think that what I was interested in was not to have one body but multiple bodies, which is always the case, right? In a lot of my productions, I'm working with multiple selves, multiple, almost like a comparative way of looking at who is Salome. And in original before the pandemic, when I first talked to Natalie, I was interested in having several Salomes on stage, someone from Iran, someone from Japan, someone from Singapore, and I thought that no, this is no longer possible in the pandemic era, because we can't even really travel. We can't travel extensively, even though now everything's lifted. But who knows, right? And the live presence is continually at threat, because even if you just get Omicron, you have to be out for a week or 2 weeks. The show can't go on. That's it, full stop. And I think that it was very important to think about what could happen, if we deal with multiple bodies, but no longer live bodies, but a kind of a rhizomatic body, a rhizome which grows out in different directions. You have the live body, you have the film body, you have the social media body, which is inside the heads of the audience and the imaginations of the audience before they come in, and also the whole sense of really being inside the cinema, and of course at a certain moment the cinema possibly breaks apart. We're exploring how it breaks apart now, in the theatre, but also the whole question of like, what is the theatre today? The theatre is the theatre a theatre which is no longer a building which is essential, perhaps, that the theatre is the social media platform. Even the cinema has proven to be no longer essential because we actually are watching Netflix. So there's a whole kind of a reconsideration of space and reconsideration of venues and of theaters and cinemas.
Yeah, thank you for that, because it also, of course, brings to mind, I think, the dirty word sometimes when we consider art and culture, you know, in the grander context of political economy or social economy is, of course, commerce and capital. Because now, for this year's edition of the Cannes Film Festival, TikTok is sponsoring a competition, and you know, this would have been unthinkable maybe, you know, even a couple of years ago. But I think, you know, with the pandemic, it has hastened a certain perspectival shift into how our own relationship to our mediated body and the moving image could be. And it is also from here, you know, I have two more questions from our audiences that I want to melt together because, you know, they follow from our current line of inquiry, and it's also something that I'm interested in asking. So my preamble is that the Salome complex involving the character Salome, which is a social media pre-performance performance, quite a mouthful, interesting, but quite a mouthful, you know, that exist on a different temporality, scale, and duration and space from the main production at large. And I just want to, you know, probe, pick your brain a little bit more about the conceptualizing of that. Because as one audience member asked, who and why is Salome? Meanwhile, another, who is especially direct, wanted to just ask you whether, you know, that exploration through the format of Instagram is in a way a parable on the nature of social media itself.
Right. I think it's quite complex because I shouldn't be a spoiler, right? Because of course the social media performance is going to develop, right? What you all know now is that she's a WTA ranked tennis player from Singapore, and this is of course a fiction, and we announced that because we don't want to be fake news, and it all is hunky-dory. She's the princess. She's the princess like Salome, loved by everybody. And then the disaster happens. So what is the disaster that will happen on the social media performance? And I would say, like, of course it is a parable, but I feel like we always enter the theater with so many histories already in our head. There is a synopsis that we've read. There is maybe some preconceived idea that, oh, this is going to be a challenging work, or oh no, my God, this is Oscar Wilde. Will I understand his witty language? Like, for example, he doesn't say the sound of a flute. He says the sound of the flute of a flute player. So this is, for me, it's like just a pre-performance of a performance. So this sense of kind of the stories in your head before you come into the theater as an audience member is actually what we are interested in, because by the time the audience member comes into the theater, they have Salome embedded into the story. Because actually Oscar Wilde doesn't give a very deep explanation of why Salome does what she does. Salome hardly speaks until the last 3 pages where there's a long monologue. And that's the last 10% of the play, because it's a short play, it's about 30 over pages. And the other things that she says are one-liners. But then suddenly she has a huge chunk. But we are, of course, having a kind of a position where we don't hear very much from Salome. So rather than putting words in her mouth, we are projecting a kind of a side story which possibly gives the reason why Salome does what she does. So we don't force Salome to say things, just like we don't force Bobola to say things, but because of the juxtapositions and the imaginations of the audience, before they walk in, they already have Salome's story. So Salome's story becomes a kind of an echo or a shadow of Salome. Yeah.
Without using spoilers too, that was quite an impressive overview, because I mean, kind of drawing from that, that is also something that I wanted to touch upon, when we were talking, in the possibilities of not a Salome, but one of many, or one and many Salomes, of that kind of plurality embedded within such a massive, evocative, and not even just misunderstood, but just ununderstood, figure, across, if you want to call it biblical visual culture till now, with the trope of the terrifying, vengeful, jilted women. And, there are all these possibilities that exist where, then the different textures and nuances of Salome allow for something transformative and maybe even curative at times. And, dwelling on an earlier point when we were talking about the ideas of fabulation, which is also the title of this particular session, I'm, of course, reminded of Tavio Nyong'o's lovely book Afro-Fabulation, where he specifically mentioned that he wasn't so much interested in the ontology or definition of fabulation as much as the possibilities of the fabulative. I might be quoting him wrong verbatim. Our lovely audiences, please fact check. But we get the gist of it, and and how it is this presentation of the locus of transformation that then becomes something richer and more poignant. And also then moving into the subjectivities of theatrical experiences, I think what is also particularly interesting is, of course, not just the subjectivity and expectations of theater going, but in that by attending a performance within this formalized and sometimes even verified arena and space, we also undergo certain rituals and transformations to our own orientations and behaviors. And it's just on this note that I think it would be lovely if we can just watch then another very brief clip on how ritual has manifested, in Michaela or Bubala's journey with us thus far. Yes. So yes, as we can see, how ritual occurs, it's something that is curative, but in a way it also visits and revisits upon traumas and violence and the different ways in which we work through them. And sometimes even speaking truth to power doesn't require a very verbal articulation. Sometimes it is gestural, sometimes it is performative. But I think what is then also interesting is precisely because there isn't a very specific attribution of reality to what either Michaela or Salome or Janice in character would articulate in their performances. So maybe you can talk to us a little bit more about how much of what they say is real versus real, REEL. Yes.
Okay, I think that one of the things which we talked about earlier about, is it fact or is it fiction, or is it actually something of everything, right? Because just like when we watch the play, is this what happened on stage, or is it something that I've carried in from outside, or is it something which I'm knitting together in my heads, right? In my head. I think that's what I love very much about the theatrical experience. It allows the audience to take ownership of the material and to weave their own story. So, of course, you know, one of the most important things I think about the SALOME narrative, and I switched to that because I think it's easier to start off from that position, is that as the trauma happens to SALOME, which will maybe the princess story will crash at some point because it has to, right? The princess story is everything that we wrote of the trauma is actually from somewhere else. We've just copied exactly certain things that were said in life. And I found that quite fascinating that we overtly copied the statements because we just kind of substituted the facts, let's say. But the frame, even the way the English is used, it's all been said before by other people in that real situation. So again, it comes back to the point of is this fact or is it fiction? Because it was said by some other real person, several real stories which are brought together, and in a way where, you know, he says, she says, they say, right? So it's a kind of, so who said what and what is real? So I think that actually what is fascinating is that when we get to the heart of SALOME, the tennis player, we actually didn't write any original lines. They were all said by other people. Yeah. With Bobola, I think that their approach to storytelling was for me quite fascinating because, of course, I couldn't use all of it in the film, right? That means that we might have the interview was maybe 20 pages long. Then when I write the script, it's 3 pages long. And in the film, you can only do like 1 page. And I think that there is a kind of a sense of this all the time of weaving something. So I felt like I was a tapestry maker, right? That I was involved in weaving these many different colored threads together. Some threads which came from their story, Bobola's story, some threads which came from me, some threads which came from Oscar Wilde's Salome, some threads which came from a sense of a conglomeration.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And I particularly enjoy when you use the word weaving because, you know, in a sense, we also, of course, what immediately comes to mind are the 3 weavers of fate in classical Greek mythology, and also then the ideas of bringing together different strands. But weaving itself is not an activity without pitfall. It is not a creation from an act of sheer will. There are active interventions to weave, and, you know, times where threads must be cut, times when things need to be rewoven. And it is particularly, I guess, from this vantage point that I also want to then touch on the idea of choreographing movements, you know, as you wove these elements together. Because what we saw in the clip is, it is both inescapably personal and intimate, and yet there is also something really, really universal about having had a crap day and lighting candles around your bathtub so that you can sink into the oblivion.
Yeah, but then you must think about what we had to do to get the candles out for me to use the bathroom after.
Yes, the different realities of performance making. But, you know, in those rituals, of which this is one of multiple, how would you maybe expand on those specific choreographic or those specific gestures? Because then are those actual curative steps that Michaela or Bobola, the character, undertakes of their own agency, or do they also then come as a form of devising in how the performance is made?
I think that's why for me it's also a change in my work of documentary performance or documentary theatre, whereby I'm much more now involved in creative documentary making. Right, and actually, again, this has already been a field which was started by, actually in the film arena, right? I mean, you have Oppenheimer with his beautiful 2 parts about Indonesia and the massacre there, the
act
race,
of killing,
the act of killing, and also Ritipan with S21 about the Cambodian killing fields, where the perpetrators were asked to reenact, not actors reenacting, but the perpetrators were asked to reenact these acts of violence, and it was done in a way where we completely get into some kind of other fiction, right? It's a fiction not of actors playing it like in a National Geographic documentary, but you become completely horrified by what happened then and by the reenactment which is being made for the camera now, and in this other third space, right? And it becomes a kind of a body which is not real, which is not fictional, but it's of this rhizomatic body, as I keep calling it, where I think that the creative documentary, as opposed to the documentary which is stuck on facts, which I used to do before, where it was very much about the truth, right? And it's actually now about the lies, possibly, right, rather than the truth. But it's everybody's truth, it's everybody's lies. And I think that my role in weaving was to weave it through the choreography of Salome. So it was the lens of Salome as a structural lens, which then allowed me to tell Bobola's story with them. So it's a kind of there were 3 elements from the Salome lens that was very important in the Oscar Wilde. One is the idea of harassment, right? Because Salome is harassed by King Herod, but at the same time, Salome harasses the man that she's attracted in. And that's one thing that we took, harassment. And the second element we took was the strange moon, that the moon is almost a predator. The moon becomes red. And the fantasy time of the moon, the dream time of the moon, or the nightmare time of the moon. And the third element, of course, is the beheading. And as I said right at the very beginning, we debated for a long time, all of us involved, about should we say that is the head of Salome rather than the head of the man. And is it a spoiler if we say that it's the head of Salome? And after quite a long time, I decided that no, actually we should say that it's the head of Salome from the very beginning. And it's a kind of political act of announcing that it is not the head of the man that you will see, but it's the head of Salome, both in the film and also in the live performance. And of course, it's because everybody knows the story of Salome in some shape or form. I think that they just know that she beheaded this man who scorned her. And therefore, we begin from there, and we actually just said, forget about that story. Let's start from her head.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Because I mean, even from the concept or the etymologies of fabulation, I think there's of course also the association with fables, which themselves are
fabulous fables.
Yes, are morality tales that are constructed with a specific didactility to them. And I think if we are to examine Salome as a fable, then it has always been cognizant, or rather it has always been intertwined with a specific moral being be not a lascivious and wanton woman, be a woman who listens to instructions, be a woman that is subservient to, another power as opposed to having the free will to desire and demand. And of course, if we want to go on a historiographical trajectory, then there is also Salome's agency in making that impetuous choice. And I think all of this add to the specific textures of Project Salome's as well, which I think particularly fascinating because in a way, the beheading of Salome also mirrors what happens to Salome, the figure and the trope. In becoming an archetype, her agency, her individuality is erased, but simultaneously they are elevated to a point of the universal and the generalized, while retaining none of their original self. And that is also something that I think is particularly powerful when we think of the thread of artistic interpretations and interpolations in bringing Salome and Salomes, and projecting them. And our time is a little tight. So I have here with me one last question from our lovely audience. And this may resonate actually with, I think, some of the points you have made over the course of our very, very lovely and rich conversation about your own practice and performance and priorities in making what has been previously termed in some sense as docu-performances in, the excising of facts from, or the sifting, the winnowing of facts from the large, grand grains of historical amnesias and consciousness. That was a real mouthful and verbose of a metaphor there. I apologize to every one of you who have to hear it. But, ultimately, how does Project Salome push, your own exploration of the genre and the form further? Or would you say it marks a departure or a shift in how then you want to approach performance makings and the different valencies of truth?
I think that I felt very strongly that I should not come back to the Singapore stage in a strange way, because Singapore is the place where I'm born, and Singapore is a place where I started my theatrical practice. I wanted to come back to the Singapore stage, having reconciled for myself what does it mean to make theatre now. And in the same way, this question of docu-performance, I was very involved in docu-performance before, and now coming back with Bobola, and also the Salome narrative, because her narrative, her fiction is also based on documentary. But this whole strangeness of a fabulous documentary. So we are fabulating a fabulous documentary, and I wanted to be freed of judgment, and I wanted to be freed of actually doing theatre and doing film, and also to be freed of the pandemic. Because I think that it has marked all of us. And I would say, like, in 2000, I began a project with several people, including Nolina Mohammed, MTA, our famous ballerina, who was the 10th dancer, and she was one of the 10% of the artists who came back from the killing fields. And I remember that when we journeyed with her and the entourage of the Cambodian dancers to the killing fields, to the work camps that they were in, all the time I was always thinking, like, did it really happen? Did this really happen? What is fiction here of what she's telling us? And really now I feel like 20 years later, I'm freed from this yoke. I'm freed from it because it doesn't matter whether it really happened. It happened for her. And, just in the same way like it happened for Bobola, and it happened for Janice in creating Salome. And of course, I feel like that's the power of this kind of work, that 20 years later I'm still evolving, and I want to continue evolving. And I think that now I'm happy to come back to the Singapore stage, because 5 years later I feel like I've evolved somewhere else, at least in my search for truth, because not that there's no truth, but it's all truth.
And thank you. I think that's a particularly poetic way, and I also just want to close off this session with a very, very brief musing then of Salomes around us and us as Salomes, and the idea of freedom and transformation and the breaking free from shackles and yokes. Because in a way, by projecting Salome, by becoming projections of Salome, this is also when we are exposed to a certain visuality and to a certain possibility of healing from trauma, from violence, from impositions of the discourses that we find ourselves in. And through that, we have a creative performance of our own selves, to our own selves, that allow us to unlock a deeper truth to how we want to be, where we want to be, and what it means to be. And with that, thank you so much, everyone, for being a part of Queer Fabulations, Worlding Bodies and Project Salome with Ong Keng Sen. And we look forward to having you with the other programs of SIFA 2022, as well as, of course, at the production of Project Salome, and finding our lovely Instagram handle for the pre-performance as well. And with that, we can call it a day. Thank you for sticking with us throughout a Friday evening. We hope everyone has had a glass of wine or something vaguely intoxicating or just enjoyable and light. And have a lovely weekend ahead. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Alphonse. Thank you very much, audience.
Yes.
Thank you.
you.